Well, grace and peace to you from our Lord Jesus Christ and God the Father in the power of the Spirit. We begin tonight our study of Ruth. And tonight we're going to be looking at the first 5 verses of Ruth. And it's interesting that when you read the first 5 verses and you read the last 6 or 7 verses, Ruth is not the central figure of the story. In fact, the first 5 verses are about Naomi and where Naomi ends up, basically. And then the last verses of Ruth, other than the genealogy that's at the end, is about the blessedness of Naomi. So you might say it begins with the tragedy of Naomi and ends with the blessedness of Naomi. And that the story in between is about how that happens. What happens? What decisions are made? Who comes in to play the kinsman redeemer? How is Naomi's life redeemed? And how is Naomi's life how does it progress towards a blessedness? And what lies behind all that is God. Right? Though God is never named as doing anything in the book of Ruth. Now, the characters talk about God, God be blessed or something like that. The characters will name God, but the narrator never says, and God did this, or God opened up this, or God showed them this, or God moved Ruth to do this. God's not mentioned by the narrator, which is like another book in the Hebrew Bible. What other book their narrator never mentions God? Esther. Yeah, the story of Esther never mentions God. But yet God is present in the story, unnamed, but assumed, right? I think that's true here in Ruth. We have this beginning tragedy, and then we have an ending blessing, and God is participating in the whole story, though God is hidden in the story. By hidden, I mean God is not named. Right? Much like in our lives, God is often hidden to us. We don't know exactly what God is doing. We don't know how God is moving us or how God is acting in this moment, or even acting in this tragedy, or even acting in this blessing. We can't really name, oh, that's what God did. At least not with clear eyes. And that's what's true in the story of Ruth. God is not named, except for some of the statements by the characters who mention God in one way or another. But we begin with tragedy and we end with blessedness. And it's about Naomi. But the other 2 characters who emerge in the story that make the difference for Naomi, those 2 characters are named, Ruth and Boaz. But God's not named, right? But Ruth and Boaz are named. God is going to work through Ruth and Boaz to move from tragedy to blessedness. And that's the essence of the story. And it happens because, in part, because Ruth is loyal to Naomi. She sticks with Naomi. She remains with Naomi. And Boaz is loyal to his family as the kinsman redeemer. So the whole sense of loyalty, the sense of, in the Hebrew Bible, it's the word chesed. Chesed, and just go ahead and H-E-S-E-D. But it's not just an H sound, it's a chesed. It's like a K-H. And it's a word that means loyalty. It means faithfulness. It means covenant faithfulness. It means I'm going to stick with this. I'm loyal to you. I'm committed to you. I'm covenanted with you. I am going to be faithful. And so Ruth is faithful to Naomi. And Boaz is faithful to the covenant, faithful to his family. And so loyalty. There's another word that describes both Ruth and Boaz. It's the word hayil, which don't really need to remember that word. Chesed is much more fundamental word in the Hebrew Bible. It's used so many times. Every book uses it. But this word is the word that means like noble character, worth. So Boaz is called a person of noble character, mighty character. And then Ruth is named also as one who is worthy character or noble character. Both Ruth and Boaz are given this title, this described with a word that means, someone who has a lot of integrity, someone who's a lot of worth, someone who's loyal. And so Naomi moves from tragedy to blessedness through the work of God, through Ruth and Boaz, who are both loyal and of noble character. They have integrity. They keep their promises. So it's a story about just life, people living their lives, but living it with integrity and living it in loyalty, and how God works through that to bless a family. Which in a lot of ways is sort of what God is still doing, right? God is still working in families to bless them through the loyalty and faithfulness of God's people who are a part of the story. So that's kind of the big picture. We don't have any idea who wrote Ruth. You read it, it's anonymous. Anybody who says they know who wrote Ruth, they don't know. There's traditions, but nobody really knows. And we don't have to know. It's part of the story of Israel that's been handed down to us. And Israel has valued it. In fact, in the Hebrew Bible, Ruth is not in the place where it is in our Protestant Bibles. What's the book before Ruth? Judges, right? What's the book after Ruth? Samuel, right? So it's situated, Ruth is put in its historical frame, right? Because the first line in the book of Ruth is, in the days when the judges ruled. So our Protestant Bibles, we didn't invent this as Protestants, but just typically speaking, Protestant Bibles, Ruth is located between Judges and Samuel because it's in that historical time. Right? But in the Hebrew Bible, it's not put in the historical books. It's put in the third category. There are three categories in the Hebrew Bible. There's the Torah with the historical, the Torah. Then there's the prophets with the historical and the prophets. And then there are the writings, where you have Psalms and Job and Proverbs and Ruth. Ruth is part of the writings. And that raises this question, well, why put it there? Why not put it in the story where it is historically? Well, that's kind of what some people thought later, we need to move this thing over here, But it was probably part of the writings because the writings were used in liturgy for, they were later writings, but they were liturgical writings, not all of them, but for the most part. But Ruth was read at various festivals, particularly the harvest festivals, which makes sense because Ruth is about a harvest, right? It's harvest time in Ruth. And so it was a reminder of God's provision, how God provided for Naomi and for Ruth through Boaz and blessed Israel with the descendants of Ruth, including King David. And so Ruth would be read as a part of a harvest celebration, reminding us of what God has blessed us with. But other than that, we don't know a whole lot about Ruth in terms of the book itself, where it came from, who wrote it, when it was written. We don't really know when it was written. That it's a part of the writings might mean that it's a later book, maybe post-exilic. Maybe it's written after the exile. We just don't know. Some would say, no, it was written before the exile, but nobody really knows. But that doesn't detract from the power of the book itself. So let's begin by reading the first 5 verses. It says, in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. And a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to live in the country of Moab, he and his wife and 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judea or Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpha, and the name of the other, Ruth. When they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Notice in verse 5, it's about Naomi, right? The woman was left. Naomi's the main character here. The woman was left. But let's think about what that tragedy is here, and the nature of the tragedy. Tragedy, right? And just watch the text unfold for us. That almost kind of like it's like a spiral of tragic circumstances that just gets deeper and deeper and deeper until the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. So let's just follow that path for a moment. It says, in the days of the judges. What do you know about the days of the judges? When the judges ruled? Who were these people? What was it like during the time of the judges? Any particulars you can remember about the days of the judges? Can you name a few judges even? Deborah, all right. Deborah's one of those good judges, right? Gideon. Huh? Gideon's one of the judges. Samson. And you notice in the book of Judges, the first 2 chapters tell us that there's a cycle. There's like a life cycle. And chapter 2 of Judges says, okay, as you read the rest of this book, this is what you can expect to see. The people will become unfaithful. God will send a chastisement or a probing, a testing, and then God will send a deliverer. Well, the people will cry out, and God will send a deliverer, and God will deliver them, and the people will be faithful, but then they will become unfaithful, and the cycle will start again, right? And in the book of Judges, it starts out pretty well with Deborah. She's probably the of the main judges that are actually talked about at any length. She's the only one that doesn't have a critical point. There's no criticism of Deborah. But you get this cycle. The judges start getting worse, and they get worse, and they get worse. Jephthah even sacrifices his own daughter. You know, Samson doesn't turn out so well, right? In terms of his judging. And then by the time you get to the end of the book of Judges, you get these stories of violence against women. Here, you know, remember in Gibeah, they wanted to know the two male guests. And the host says here, no, take my concubine. And they abuse her. And then the Benjamites, you know, are punished for that. But then they're so punished that they need wives, and so they can go grab women. At the end, there's a story about how we're going to let these guys go grab the women they want. Violent abuse of women. And there's a line in the book of Judges. It's said twice towards the end. I think one's in chapter 21, the other one's in 17 maybe. It says, and there was no king in those days, and everyone what? Yeah, did what was right in their own eyes. Well, that tells you the world they're living in, right? So when Ruth begins with this, we're living in chaotic times. During the time that the judges ruled, you know, that's like saying, during the time when we lived under Nazi regime, during the time when we lived under tyranny of some sort, during the time when we lived under, there was no law and everybody did what they wanted. I mean, that's not the time you want to live, right? That's not very good at the beginning in the first place. So what's the next thing that is said in the story? They lived in the time of Judges, and then what's the next thing? Yeah, now there's a famine in the land. Now, what we have to remember about Israel, Judah and Israel, it was an agricultural society. And in Israel, you didn't irrigate. Now, you lived in Egypt along the Nile, you could irrigate from the Nile because it was all flat land, and they learned to do irrigation very early on. But in Israel, you can't irrigate. The only river is the Jordan River, and it's in a deep gully, and it's surrounded by hills. You can't farm that land. So all farming, all agriculture was dependent upon rain. If it didn't rain, you weren't going to eat. So famine was kind of had a regular cycle. You remember even in the book of Acts, there's a famine in the land. And they're raising money in Antioch to send money down to Jerusalem in Acts chapter 11. So a famine was not an unusual thing. But it was a hardship because people starve during famines.
Was it a drought?
Probably a drought. Probably caused by a drought. Now, sometimes famine can be caused by political and economic factors. So that's possible. That if you had somebody came in and I don't know, that would cause a famine, but it would have the same effect as a famine. It wouldn't necessarily cause a famine, right? Yeah, well, okay. There's natural famines, and then there's politically, economically caused famines in the sense that the food is stolen, or the food is confiscated, or the taxation's so high. Yeah, so that could create a famine. Yeah. We're not told exactly what this one is, but probably a drought, I would guess. So what's the next thing that happens? What does this family do? They move where?
Moab.
From Judah to Moab. Now, that doesn't shock us, but it would shock somebody in Judah. That's like saying, I don't know if this is a good comparison or not. It's like saying things are so bad here in the United States, I'm going to move my family to Mexico. Or even worse, things are so bad here in the United States that I'm going to move my family to Iran, an enemy of the United States. Because when you think about Moab, what's the story of Moab in the Hebrew Bible? What do we know about Moab? Anything you
were on the way to the land, they wouldn't give them safe passage.
Yeah, that's right. So here's Israel, Sea of Galilee, the Dead Sea, right? Bethlehem is located right about here. And Judah is kind of this tribal territory there. That's Judah. Moab is down here, right? And this is called the plains of Moab over here. So, as you said, when Israel was coming up from Egypt out of the wilderness, Moab opposed them. Remember, the king of Moab was the one who wanted Balaam to curse Israel. Right? So Moab was in opposition to Israel. Moab, remember, was the child of Lot and his daughter, along with Ammon, the two sons, Ammon and Moab. And in fact, the Moabites were so ostracized by Israel because of what Moab did to Israel that Deuteronomy 23 says that no Moabite or Ammonite can be a part of the assembly of the Lord to the 10th generation. So when you're talking about Moab, you're talking about an enemy. You're talking about something that is almost defiling, right? This is not the natural place to move to, especially when you're in part of Judah and the land you live on in Judah is the land of your father and your grandfather and your great-grandfather. Because remember, the land was given to families. And if you lost that land for whatever reason, maybe because of a famine, you might lose the ability to keep that land. You still got it back during the year of Jubilee. The land would return to the family. Right? So for this family, who is from Epaphra of Bethlehem, which is probably kind of like a little suburb of Bethlehem, and to name it is to say, this is kind of an important family. Maybe this is their clan. Epaphra is their clan. Because remember, we're talking about a tribal society. Tribal society where the family lives together for in a typical Israelite family, it wasn't just mom, dad, and the kids. It was mom, dad, and the kids, and it was the father and mother of mom and dad, and it was the grandfather and grandmother of mom and dad. And it was their brothers. They all lived on the same land, and sometimes even in the same tent, right? I mean, these huge tents, not like old pup tent, right? Just these huge tents, right? So it was always extended family. It wasn't a nuclear family. Nuclear family didn't exist in the ancient world because you couldn't survive as a nuclear family. Because you needed people to farm. You needed people to work the land. You needed people to do the chores. And that's why kids were important. And that's why you needed to raise a big family. But Elimelech and Naomi decide to go to Moab. They're leaving their ancestral land. going to a place that you would think would be inhospitable to them. That tells you how bad it was, right? This must have been a really terrible famine, that they would leave their land, maybe even leave their father and mother behind, maybe even leave their extended family. Maybe they leave and that's not appreciated by the rest of the family. We don't know. But it is kind of strange that it's only a mom and dad and 2 kids who go. I mean, when Joseph, during a famine, invited his family to come live, the whole bunch came, right? But here it's just 4 people who leave. That's strange as well. And maybe we could just guess, and we're guessing, I'm guessing here, I don't know this, but I'm guessing that might not have been appreciated on the part of those who remained in Judah, that they went to Moab. Maybe not. We're not told that part. But what we are told is that they went to the country of Moab and they stayed there. What happens next? Now, they get to the land of Moab and they stay there. What happens next in verse 3?
Husband died.
Yeah. Elimelech dies. By the way, his name means my God is king. That's what his name means. My God is king. Okay, that's the worst scenario you can imagine in ancient culture. The breadwinner dies. The patriarch dies.
In a foreign land.
In a foreign land. I don't know that we can imagine. I mean, we can imagine the distress of the husband of a family dying. We've experienced that in different ways, probably. We can imagine that. But typically, when we experience that, there's a lot of support system around. There's relatives. There's economic help. There are ways for a widow to support herself. But you're in Moab, you're a foreigner in a foreign land, and your primary economic stability disappears. That's tragic. And it might be that the sons are not fully of age yet, because they're not married yet. But after the husband dies, we're told they get married. Who do they marry? The sons marry Moabites. And you wonder, how's that going to go over in Judah? You know? When Abraham wanted Isaac to marry, what did he do? Did he take one of the local girls? No, he sent his servant back to the home country to find a relative, find someone who is of the family, right? To marry within the family. I mean, the larger extended family, right? So when these 2 sons marry Moabites, and Moabites are not allowed in the assembly of the Lord to the 10th generation, that's got to be distressful. Right? And it's part of the story of bringing Ruth the Moabite. You notice when Ruth is mentioned, it's typically Ruth the Moabitess, as if the narrator wants us never to forget that Ruth is a Moabite, not an Israelite. She's a Moabite. Right? She's a foreigner in Israel, that is. So I wonder to what extent this would be a tragic sort of thing in the family. We're not told that it was a tragic sort of thing. We're not told that this was evil or bad. But given what we know about Israel's culture, we can perhaps hear it as, what'd you do that for? You know, maybe Naomi, when your husband died, you should have gone back to Judah. And then your boys could have found some girls in Israel, right? And Judah. But you stayed and they married Moabites. What's the next thing we learn about? The sons marry Moabites, and then what happens? Yeah.
10 years.
They died. They lived about 10 years. When they had lived there about 10 years, then the two sons died. Maybe we can add something else to that before the sons die. 10 years. Does the text mention any grandbabies?
Nope.
Oh, maybe we can add something here that they were without children.
They may not have gotten married. They may have gone over when the kids were 10 years old. Who knows?
Yeah, you would think that 10 years, married 10 years. We're not exactly sure the 10 years refers to how long or what period. But yeah, you would think that maybe one of them would have had children, but no children. Now, again, remember the culture. What does farming depend on? Having children, right? And the blessedness of a family is having children. And we know enough stories in Genesis, right? Sarah, Rebecca, Hagar. We know enough stories about the importance of having children. Hannah and Samuel, right? That this lack of children was maybe not, I'm going to mute here. Maybe this is part of the tragedy. Maybe Naomi doesn't have any grandchildren, which means her future is in danger, especially when her sons die. Because now she has no male heir. She has no children, grandchildren. She is totally on the outside. She is without resource. She is without support. She is in the worst possible situation a woman could be in ancient Israelite culture. This is one of the reasons why there's such an emphasis in the Hebrew Bible on supporting widows and the fatherless, because they had no other resource. There was no Social Security net, right? It was the people. It was their families. But she has no family, at least not in Moab. Now, some people look at that and say, well, maybe they should not have left, and this is God's punishment. I mean, the famine is probably a punishment from God. The fact that the father dies is probably a punishment from God. That the sons die is probably a punishment from God, because they shouldn't have left the land. They should have stayed in the land. They should have stayed with their inheritance. But God kind of punishes them. It doesn't say that, though. It doesn't say God is punishing them. I think that's a little much to be able to to say with any certainty, oh yeah, they're getting punished. I think it's more likely that Naomi is like Job. Job was not being punished, right? Job suffered his losses not because he deserved those losses. He was innocent, but he still suffered the tragedies. And I think we could say something similar about Naomi. Naomi is kind of the female Job, if you want to put it that way. Or we should say Naomi is a woman and Job is a man, and they both suffered tremendous loss. And Naomi expects to be alone totally, right? Because what does she tell her daughter-in-laws to do?
Oh.
Yeah, go home, go back to your family in Moab. Start over. You're young, you can start over. Right? So she is expecting to be totally alone. We'll see how that changes in the next section of the book. But when we leave Naomi here in verse 5, we have a Job figure who has suffered a kind of cascading tragedy. Started out in the Judges, then it's a famine, then they have to leave their ancestral home or starve, then the husband dies, and then they marry Moabite women, not Israelite women, then the sons die, and they don't have any children. It's just cascades, one tragedy after another. Yeah.
How did Moabite fail that Jewish faith?
How did the Moabites fail the Jewish people?
Feel about it.
Oh, how did the Moabites feel about the Israelites, the Judites? Well, we know what Balak, right, wanted Balaam to do, and that would only been within the last, depending on what time period Ruth is in, towards the end of the Judges, maybe 100 years ago. I mean, animosity hangs around quite a while, so probably they weren't too receptive. They were enemies of Israel. In fact, at one point, Moab attacks Israel. So we can't say for sure, but I imagine going to Moab into a hostile environment, into an unknown environment where you think we may not be welcome.
Would you be adding something to it? It just says they married Moabite men. There's a lot more to that than you saying, Moabite man.
Moabite,
Man.
that the women married Moabite women.
Her two sons.
Two sons married Moabite women.
There's
Right?
a lot more to that.
Yeah, I mean we're getting a one-liner here, right? We're not being told the whole story. We could probably we could build a Chosen episode around it or something, right? What's the backstory to all this? Well, we don't know. We're just told kind of matter-of-factly. I think it's the matter-of-fact way we're told this that just gives us the sense of, you get that feeling like bad stuff has happened and we're just waiting for the other shoe to drop. You know that expression? You're waiting for the other shoe to drop. Well, there's a lot of shoes that dropped here that culminated in her being totally alone. Kind of like Job on the ash heap. So that's the beginning of Ruth. It's about Naomi. It's about the tragic life of Naomi. And how can anyone recover from this? Yeah.
I think you could also suppose that Naomi moved into a community of folks that accepted her who didn't really have the animosity that most Moabites had.
Yeah. Yeah, you could suppose that. Yeah. They stayed 10 years. Yeah, I think that they stayed 10 years meant that they weren't run out, that they were in some
They
sense
weren't
accepted, right? And that would not be necessarily the expectation, but it turned out to be the case that they were able to marry Moabite women. So they were accepted in some sense. Yeah. Well, next week, or not next week, the week after next, we will pick up at verse 6. May the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, and the love of God, and the communion of the Holy Spirit be with us all. Amen. Oh, and next week, let me shut this off.